July 10, 1945. A German submarine surfaces off Mar del Plata. It is the U-530. Its commander, Otto Wermuth, surrenders the vessel with 54 crew members. The inspection reveals an anomalous pattern. The navigation log destroyed, the Enigma machine missing, and all encrypted documentation eliminated. Only a chart of southern currents remains outside standard cartography. That operational void points to a route: Antarctica, the sector of New Swabia, in Queen Maud Land. There, the German expedition of 1938 had identified the Schirmacher oases, temperate zones beneath the ice that supported Base 211, the Reich's secret subglacial installation. In addition, hours before the surrender, an Argentine police officer had reported 2 people disembarking from a submarine onto a deserted beach. Allied intelligence services investigated for years the possibility that they were Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun. 38 days later, the U-977 arrived with identical documentary anomalies. Both commanders had taken nearly twice the time required to cross the Atlantic. Where were they during that time? What motive led 2 German commanders to destroy all the documentation of their submarines before surrendering? And what did they conceal beneath the Antarctic ice that never appeared in the public reports? Why did 2 German submarines appear in Argentina after the end of World War II? In the early hours of July 10, 1945, an officer of the Buenos Aires provincial police wrote a report that his superiors filed away without immediate consequences. A coastal patrol had observed, from a deserted beach south of the Argentine capital, the silhouette of a submarine partially surfacing a short distance from the shore. 2 people disembarked by boat. One wore a military uniform. The other was dressed in civilian clothing. Both disappeared inland before the officers could identify them. That same day, the German submarine U-530 entered the port of Mar del Plata and surrendered to the Argentine Navy. The war in Europe had ended 62 days earlier. No one expected a German submarine in July 1945. No one had an explanation either for the police report that had been sitting for hours in the archives of the Buenos Aires province. On May 8, 1945, Admiral Karl Dönitz transmitted to all operational U-boats the order to surrender, raise the black flag, surface, and proceed to the nearest Allied port. Of the 156 submarines operational at that moment, 154 followed the instruction between May 8th and May 14th. 16 commanders chose to scuttle their own boats during Operation Regenbogen, defying Dönitz's explicit order, which had forbidden self-destruction in order not to worsen the negotiating conditions of the armistice. The other 2 ignored both instructions. They set course for the south. They disappeared from the North Atlantic for months, and they reappeared in Argentina 38 days apart in the same port with explanations that Allied intelligence services never found entirely satisfactory. To understand why 2 24-year-old lieutenants made that decision, it is necessary to understand what surrender meant in May 1945 for an officer of the Kriegsmarine. Germany was not negotiating terms with the Allies. It was surrendering unconditionally to a total occupation whose scope no one could clearly define in those weeks. The trials the Allies had announced in Nuremberg had no precedent in international law. Their potential scope was undefined, and the question of what level of responsibility might reach an officer who had executed orders during the war had no clear answer. The Morgenthau Plan, leaked to the neutral press since 1944, proposed dismantling German industry and turning the country into an agrarian nation permanently incapable of rearmament. Allied prisoner-of-war camps in Western Europe held more than 3 million German soldiers in improvised facilities for a volume of surrendered troops that no planning had anticipated. Conditions in those camps ranged from tolerable to what survivors would describe decades later in terms their captors would dispute. For a commander with the autonomy to cross the Atlantic, surrender in Europe was a full stop. The Southern Hemisphere, by contrast, was an ellipsis, a gamble in which uncertainty was the price of freedom. The difference between those 2 options was not ideological for either of the men who chose it. It was the difference between accepting a known future and wagering on an unknown one. Otto Wermuth was born in 1920 and joined the Kriegsmarine in 1939. He served as a watch officer on several submarines, including U-853, before receiving command of U-530 in January 1945. He was not an officer with a distinguished combat record nor with documented ideological connections to the party. He was a naval technician whom the war had promoted rapidly because the conflict consumed experienced officers faster than the shipyards could produce submarines. The U-530 was a Type 9C/40, the Kriegsmarine's long-range model designed for oceanic patrols lasting several months with sufficient autonomy to operate in the South Atlantic without resupply. It had completed 6 war patrols under its previous commander. When Wermuth assumed command in January 1945, U-530 was a veteran submarine with an experienced crew, and Wermuth was a new commander with 3 months of command over a boat the crew knew better than he did. On April 6, 1945, with Soviet forces 80 kilometers from Berlin and the Western Allies crossing the Rhine, U-530 departed from Kiel with orders to operate off the coast of New York. It was Wermuth's first real mission as the commander of an operational submarine. Between May 4th and May 7th, he launched 8 torpedoes in 3 attacks off Long Island with no confirmed results. On May 8th, he was south of the island with empty tubes, an intact fuel reserve, and an order he could choose not to follow. The decision he made at that moment was not recorded in any document that has survived, because Wermuth destroyed all documentation aboard U-530 before arriving in Argentina. What is known of his reasoning comes exclusively from his statements during subsequent interrogations, statements his interrogators considered unsatisfactory on several fundamental points. Wermuth declared that he feared reprisals or mistreatment if he surrendered to the Allies, that he had chosen Argentina because he believed he would receive more dignified treatment in a country with historical ties to Germany, and that he had no knowledge of any prior plan or special mission related to his destination. Those statements were verifiable on exactly 0 points because all the documentation that might have supported or contradicted them had been destroyed before the submarine reached port. Wermuth had eliminated the evidence before anyone could question him about it. Heinz Schäfer had followed a different path to the same moment of decision. Born in 1921, he joined the Kriegsmarine at 17 after obtaining a certificate in inland navigation that revealed a nautical vocation predating the war and any military indoctrination. He served as a watch officer on 4 Atlantic patrols between 1941 and 1943, the most brutal period of the submarine campaign, when the loss rate of U-boats reached its peak and the life expectancy of an active crewman in the North Atlantic was measured in weeks. He later commanded U-148, a training submarine in the Baltic, for 14 months before receiving command of U-977 in February 1945. That difference in experience compared to Wermuth was substantial. Schäfer had seen the Atlantic when it was still possible to survive in it without the level of luck that the statistics of 1944 required. He had managed men under real pressure and had learned that decisions made under conditions of uncertainty have consequences that cannot always be corrected afterward. On May 2, 1945, U-977 departed from Kristiansand with orders to patrol the English Channel and attack Allied traffic in Southampton, a port that in May 1945 had permanent air cover, anti-submarine barriers, and a concentration of naval escorts that made the penetration of a U-boat practically impossible. It was a mission with no real chance of success, assigned in the final weeks of an already lost war to a submarine the command needed to keep occupied. On May 7th, while sailing north of Scotland, news of Germany's surrender arrived by radio. Schäfer was in Norwegian waters, far from any immediate Allied presence, with a crew of 48 men and enough fuel to cross the Atlantic. What Schäfer did next is the element that most clearly distinguishes his case from Wermuth's, and the testimonies of his crew, collected decades later, confirm it consistently. He assembled the entire crew in the central compartment of the submarine and presented them with 3 options without wrapping them in the language of obligation or loyalty to the Reich. They could surrender at a Norwegian port under Allied control. They could attempt to return to Germany, or they could set course for Argentina. He did not make the decision for them. 30 men voted for Argentina. 16, most of them married, chose to return to their families. 2 asked to disembark in Spain during the voyage. On May 10th, Schäfer transferred the 16 men who wanted to return into inflatable boats near the island of Holsnøy off the Norwegian coast. All of them fell into British hands a few hours later and were repatriated without incident. With 32 men on board, U-977 turned south. What was the crew trying to hide, and why did the German submarine destroy all its documentation before surrendering? When officers of the Argentine Navy boarded U-530 on July 10, 1945, the first thing they looked for was the standard documentation that any warship carries during active operations. They found no logbooks, no war diaries. The navigation charts, stripped of their annotations, were blank canvases. There were no communications codes or mission orders. Not even a single document established the identity of the 54 crew members, including the man who claimed to be named Otto Wermuth. A German war submarine had crossed the Atlantic for 130 days and arrived without a single sheet of paper establishing who it was, where it came from, what route it had followed, or what it had done since leaving Kiel on April 6th. Kriegsmarine regulations regarding navigation records were among the most stringent of any navy of the period. A U-boat on active patrol maintained daily records of astronomical and estimated position, fuel consumption by engine, the status of weapons and torpedoes, weather conditions, any contact with enemy forces, and any relevant technical or human incident. That documentation was audited after each patrol and constituted the primary source upon which command evaluated the performance of each commander and planned subsequent missions. Destroying it was not an act an officer carried out through spontaneous initiative or negligence. It required a deliberate decision executed systematically across every archive aboard the vessel at some point during the 130 days of the voyage, with the certainty that no one in the German chain of command could any longer demand its presentation, because that chain of command had ceased to exist. Wermuth did not explain during the subsequent interrogations when he had destroyed the documentation, at what point in the voyage he had done so, or what the specific reason had been. His interrogators recorded that absence of explanation with the same meticulousness with which they recorded the absence of the documents themselves. The second anomaly was the deck gun. U-530 had left Kiel on April 6th with a deck gun installed on the exterior of the hull, a significant rarity for German submarines in 1945. Since 1943, the standard practice of the Kriegsmarine had been to remove those guns because Allied air superiority over the Atlantic made surface combat suicidal, and because the weight of deck armament impaired maneuverability while submerged, the only condition in which a U-boat could survive in those years. That U-530 departed Kiel in April 1945 with a gun installed was already an anomaly relative to the standard practice of the period. That it arrived in Mar del Plata without it, with crew members stating that it had been thrown overboard during the voyage, added another layer of inexplicability. No crew member specified the position where that disposal had taken place or offered a coherent operational reason for a decision that involved discarding weaponry before a voluntary surrender to authorities who were not enemies. The third anomaly was the sabotage of the engines. During the final approach to Mar del Plata, members of U-530's crew mixed acid with the oil in the lubrication system of the diesel engines, rendering them permanently and irreversibly inoperable. It was a precise technical act that required access to the vessel's lubrication system and specific knowledge of its most vulnerable points. It was not something that could occur by accident or through the spontaneous initiative of a sailor without instructions. It was a deliberate action carried out with technical knowledge at the exact moment of voluntary surrender. If the crew was surrendering voluntarily to authorities of a country that was not an enemy of Germany, sabotaging the engines at the last moment had no operational logic that interrogators could identify. It did, however, have a very specific logic if the objective was to prevent the submarine from being easily operated, studied, or used by those who received it. The Argentine Navy recorded the condition of the engines in its initial report. The United States Navy, when it assumed control of the case, noted that the disabling had been carried out far too systematically to be accidental. The fourth anomaly was time, and it was the most difficult to explain under any version Wermuth could offer. The direct route from U-530's position in the North Atlantic on May 8th, south of Long Island, to Mar del Plata, following the currents of the Western Atlantic and navigating under the standard operational profile of a Type 9C/40 under normal conditions, required between 45 and 60 days. Wermuth took 130 days counted from departure from Kiel on April 6, or 122 days from the position he held when he received the surrender order on May 8. The difference between the strictly necessary time for the crossing and the time actually taken was between 60 and 70 days without verifiable navigational justification. Wermuth stated that the slow pace was due to the need to travel submerged in order to avoid Allied patrols active in the Atlantic. The U-530's snorkel did indeed allow partial submerged navigation. But traveling submerged using the snorkel reduces cruising speed to between 5 and 7 knots, not to 1/3 of the speed that the direct route would have required. For Wermuth's explanation to align mathematically with the 122 days used, U-530 would have had to spend weeks navigating in positions that did not correspond to any direct route south. What that implied was that U-530 had not followed a direct route to Argentina. It had been somewhere else during those additional weeks, where for what purpose and under whose orders were the questions Wermuth never answered, and which the absence of documentation made impossible to resolve through independent means. It was within this context of accumulated anomalies that the second Wermuth appeared. Days after U-530 arrived in Mar del Plata, while the crew remained under Argentine custody at the naval base facilities, a man presented himself to the authorities in Buenos Aires claiming to be Otto Wermuth, commander of U-530. The immediate problem was that the officer who had brought the submarine into port and had identified himself as Otto Wermuth to Argentine officers during the surrender was still under custody in Mar del Plata. There were now 2 men claiming to be the same person. The first, the one who had surrendered the boat, was tall and blonde. The second, the one who appeared days later in Buenos Aires, was short and dark-haired, physically different. Neither had identification documents. The report written by the United States Naval Attaché in Buenos Aires on July 24, 1945, recorded the episode with the precision of someone documenting an anomaly he could not resolve. Before authorities could confront both men simultaneously and determine which one was the real commander of U-530, the first, the blonde man who had delivered the submarine, had disappeared into the interior of Argentina. He was never located afterward. The report offered no resolution because none had been found. That report remained classified for decades beyond the automatic declassification period established by United States regulations. The extended classification of a document concerning the routine surrender of a submarine without special passengers or declared cargo had no ordinary bureaucratic justification. The documents that were eventually declassified showed that interrogators subjected Wermuth, the man who remained in custody after the other's disappearance, to repeated sessions focused on the same set of questions. Whether he had transported undeclared passengers at any point during the voyage, whether he had disembarked anyone on the Argentine coast before the official surrender, whether he had knowledge of similar missions carried out by other U-boats, whether he had received instructions about the final destination of the journey before or during the crossing, and what he had done during the additional 70 days that had no navigational justification. Wermuth answered no to all those questions in terms his interrogators described as generic to the point of implausibility. Without documentation to contradict his statements and without documentation to support them, the interrogators could not move beyond the verbal declarations of a man whose very identity had been in question ever since the first Wermuth disappeared into the interior of the country. The disappearance of that first man in Argentina in July 1945 was not a difficult operation for someone with the right connections. Since 1943, the Argentine Navy's intelligence service had established a channel of cooperation with the German SS that included providing Argentine identity documents to German agents active in South America. That channel was not dismantled after Germany's surrender in May 1945. Instead, its function was transformed. The same networks that had facilitated the movement of spies during the war began managing the provision of new identities for people who needed to vanish from European records. Within that operational system, giving a man a new identity and relocating him into the interior of a country spanning 3 million square kilometers was a logistical operation carried out with established resources. What no Allied report ever confirmed with verifiable evidence was who had ordered the double Wermuth operation, what had led the first commander to need to disappear before being formally interrogated, and how that disappearance related to the 70 days the U-530 had spent in the Atlantic without any direct route to justify them. The police report from the province of Buenos Aires, which described two people disembarking from a submarine on a deserted beach the night before the U-530 officially surrendered in port, was never thoroughly investigated by Argentine authorities. It was filed away. The journalist who published it days after the U-530's arrival was more specific than the police report in his conclusions. He suggested that the two disembarked individuals could have been Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun disguised as a man. That specific identification never had any documentary support, and Allied intelligence services, including the FBI, which actively investigated the possibility for years, found no verifiable evidence that Hitler had survived past April 1945. But the question of who the two people the Argentine officer observed disembarking on that deserted beach actually were, and whether the testimony was accurate, was never officially answered. The report exists. The identities of the two disembarked individuals are not recorded in any available document, and the U-530, the only ship that could have provided physical evidence of that episode, was sunk as a target on November 28, 1947, before any systematic technical exploration of its interior had been conducted and publicly documented by any official body. What secret stop did the U-977 submarine make before reaching Argentina? The U-977 arrived in Mar del Plata on August 17, 1945, with its logbooks intact, the navigation charts annotated from Kristiansand, and its communication records undestroyed. This stood in stark contrast to the U-530, which had docked in the same port 38 days earlier without a single document on board. This difference was the first thing Argentine officers noted in their initial report. While the documentary evidence seemingly absolved Schäfer of the most obvious accusation, that of deliberately destroying evidence as Wermuth had done, it did not answer the questions raised by the contents of those records, questions that would occupy investigators in the weeks that followed. The U-977's logbooks recounted a voyage. What the interrogators needed to determine was whether that voyage had actually taken place. The central statement Schäfer made during the interrogations following surrender was that of 66 days of continuous submerged operation using the snorkel from May 10th, the date he had disembarked 16 men in Holsnoy, until July 14th, when he claimed to have surfaced definitively for the journey to Argentina. 66 days was an extraordinary record. It was the second longest period of continuous submersion documented in Kriegsmarine history, surpassed only by the 68 days of the U-978. The claim was technically verifiable at one specific point. The U-977 had departed Hamburg in early 1945 with batteries that were only charged to 70% of their nominal capacity. Schäfer had requested full charges before sailing, but command had denied it due to material shortages. A Type 7C submarine relied on its batteries to power its electric motors while fully submerged when the snorkel was inactive. With batteries at 70%, the submarine's maneuvering capability in emergency conditions, when the snorkel had to be closed to avoid detection by aircraft or surface ships, was reduced to a margin classified by Kriegsmarine technical manuals as operationally critical. 66 days of submersion under such battery degradation would have been impossible without significant technical incidents that appear nowhere in the logbook entries Schäfer presented to his interrogators. The report issued by the United States Navy on September 19, 1945, after interrogating the U-977 and its commander in Portsmouth, made no mention of the 66 days of continuous submersion. It neither validated nor explicitly refuted them. It simply omitted them. Instead, the report noted that, immediately following the disembarkation of the 16 men in Holsnoy, the U-977 had set a northwest-west course toward the Iceland Passage, had been detected once upon sighting an aircraft and had submerged, and had been detected again upon sighting a surface ship and had submerged once more. Being repeatedly located by radio direction finding during the last weeks of May 1945, A northwest course from Holsnoy did not point toward Argentina. It pointed to a different oceanic area. If the route reconstructed through radio triangulation was accurate, the U-977 had not begun its journey to Argentina on May 10th, the date Schäfer claimed. It had been elsewhere until it ceased to be detected. Schäfer never modified his version of events in response to that report. He instead made it the title of his book, published in 1952 as U-Boot 977, 66 Days Under the Water. The researcher Julio Muti, who analyzed Kriegsmarine operational history files and career records in 2013, identified a second category of inaccuracies in the book. Schäfer had presented himself on the cover of the first 1955 edition as Kapitänleutnant, the German equivalent of corvette captain, a rank he had never attained. His effective rank throughout the war was Oberleutnant zur See, a lower grade equivalent to lieutenant commander. This discrepancy was neither a typographical error nor a mistranslation of titles. It was a deliberate presentation of a more distinguished career than the Kriegsmarine records documented. Muti also identified combat episodes that Schäfer described in the book as his own experiences, but that the files placed in U-445 patrols, the submarine where Schäfer had served as a watch officer, on dates and under circumstances that did not correspond to his direct participation. A man who exaggerates his rank and attributes experiences in his account that he did not personally live through is building an image of authority and credibility unsupported by his actual credentials. The operational question this pattern raised was clear. If Schäfer had adjusted other aspects of his narrative with the same liberty he applied to his rank and wartime achievements, which other elements of the U-977's voyage might be subject to the same freedom of embellishment? There was an additional detail regarding the composition of the U-977's crew that Allied files recorded but did not examine in depth. The first officer of the boat, the highest-ranking officer after Schäfer and the man who would have had independent access to navigation records and full knowledge of the actual route throughout the voyage, was not among the 32 crew members who arrived in Mar del Plata. He had been relieved of his post before departing Kristiansand on May 2, 1945. Replacing a first officer in the final days of the war, with the Reich in total collapse and the crew about to undertake an Atlantic crossing of complete uncertainty, removed the only independent witness with full access to the submarine's navigation information. Interrogators duly noted this detail. In Portsmouth, Allied officers asked him repeatedly, according to his own testimony, "You have hidden Hitler. Tell us now, where is he?" That specific formulation was not the kind of question an intelligence service asks when speculating based on press rumors. It was the question posed when prior classified information exists that cannot yet be confirmed through documents. Allied intelligence services knew in August 1945 from their own sources in Argentina, from the Buenos Aires provincial police report, and from testimonies collected in the preceding months regarding submarine activity along the Argentine Atlantic coast before the U-530's official surrender, that something had occurred on that coast that was not being satisfactorily explained. Schäfer was released in 1947 after 2 years in Allied custody. He did not return to Germany. He settled in Argentina in 1950, 3 years after his release and 2 years before publishing his book. He chose Mar del Plata as his place of residence, the same city where he had surrendered the submarine, where several of his former crew members still lived, and where the German community, established decades earlier, offered social and economic networks to newcomers with European surnames. He married an Argentine woman of German descent and had a son who would later become a well-known journalist in the city. The man who had declared to his interrogators that he had no prior connection to Argentina before the voyage built his personal life in that same country, in that same city, within that same community, during the years when the files on the case remained classified. The FBI document dated July 14, 1945, drafted by the Los Angeles office, recorded a specific operational reconstruction. Hitler had disembarked from the U-530 on June 20th near San Julian Bay in the province of Santa Cruz in southern Patagonia. Waiting for him on that coast was Major Justo Leon Bengoa, an officer of the Argentine army, whose documented mission was to escort him to a hideout in the interior of the country. The report did not specify the exact destination but indicated the Chaco region. FBI agents who traveled to the designated coastal area found human footprints leading out of the water and across the sand, as well as tire tracks from a vehicle positioned perpendicular to the shore in a pickup orientation. These tracks did not correspond to any documented fishing or tourist activity in that coastal strip at that time. On July 27, 1945, 3 weeks after the official surrender of the U-530 and 3 weeks before the U-977 surrendered, Commissioner Luis Mariotti received in Necochea a report from a local resident who had observed light signals from the beach being answered from the sea. The police apprehended the signaller, a German craftsman known in the town as Moreno, who lived on 67th Street. Moreno admitted that he was communicating with a submarine preparing to make a landing. The brigade that inspected the area with 3 vehicles found traces of trucks in a zone through which traffic rarely passed, and marks in the sand consistent with the dragging of heavy objects such as crates or boats toward the interior. The tracks led to the entrance of the Moramar estate, at that time owned by the German company Safico. The Argentine Navy filed the report with the Ministry of the Navy, which did not publish the corresponding documents that year. In the 1950s, 2 former crew members of the battleship Graf Spee, who had remained interned in Argentina since 1939, Walter Dettelmann and Mariano Alfredo Schultz, acknowledged having participated in the reception of 2 submarines on Patagonian beaches between July 28 and 29, 1945. They declared that from these submarines disembarked individuals they described as high-ranking officials, along with a cargo they defined as valuable. They did not provide names. The fact that 2 men who had been living in Argentina for 6 years under no legal obligation to report anything about events prior to their internment voluntarily mentioned their participation in a submarine reception operation on Patagonian beaches in July 1945 was precisely the kind of testimony that investigators could not categorize as propaganda or self-serving invention. The British intelligence document that the Allies added to the file that same month indicated that official circles in London insisted that Hitler had disembarked in Argentina on June 30th. The document also noted a specific physical detail linking the landing to the U-530, the missing rubber boat from the standard equipment of the submarine when it was inspected in Mar del Plata on July 10th. A rubber boat of the standard dimensions for a Type 9C-40 U-boat could carry between 6 and 8 people in calm coastal seas. The U-530 arrived in port without that boat. In 2017, the CIA declassified a 3-page document showing that the agency had actively investigated the possibility that Adolf Hitler had survived past April 30th, 1945, and remained alive in South America at least until 1955. 10 years after the end of the war. The document described the case of Philipp Citroen, a former member of the German SS who claimed to meet regularly with Hitler in Colombia during 1954. Citroen provided the CIA agents who contacted him with a photograph in which he appeared alongside a man he identified as Hitler. The document recorded that the CIA agents had evaluated the information and concluded that they could not verify it with the resources available. The CIA did not close the file as unfounded. It closed it as unverifiable. The distinction between these 2 categories is operationally significant. An intelligence agency closes a file as unfounded when it has exhausted investigative avenues and found evidence that the information was false. It closes a file as unverifiable when the lines of investigation have produced no conclusive evidence in either direction. This CIA file on Hitler being alive in Colombia in 1954 existed in parallel with the FB1 files on Hitler being alive in Argentina since 1945. If the investigation had concluded that Hitler had died in Berlin on April 30th, and that both agencies had verified this with sufficient certainty to close the case, there would have been no reason for the CIA to continue investing resources in evaluating testimonies about Hitler in Colombia 9 years after the events. Why did Nazi Germany explore Antarctica before the war, and where did they build the secret base? On November 30th, 1946, during the Nuremberg tribunal sessions, the prosecutor questioned Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz about a statement he had made in 1943 before a select group of Kriegsmarine officers. Dönitz had declared in that meeting that the German submarine fleet had reason to be proud of having built, for the Führer, an impregnable fortress in another part of the world. The prosecutors requested coordinates. Dönitz denied that the statement carried the meaning the prosecutors attributed to it. He offered no alternative explanation of what he had meant by another part of the world, or impregnable fortress. He died on December 24, 1980, without ever publicly clarifying the statement. The record of the session in which the prosecutor asked about coordinates remained in the tribunal archives. Dönitz's 1943 statement had a specific geographical antecedent stemming from an expedition carried out 4 years earlier. During the austral summer of 1938 to 1939, Germany sent the ship Schwabenland to the South Atlantic sector corresponding to the Antarctic continent on a mission of aerial mapping of the territory Norway claimed as Queen Maud Land. German pilots flew over approximately 600,000 square kilometers of Antarctic terrain in 44 flights, dropping metal markers with swastikas every 30 kilometers to signal a territorial claim Germany would call New Swabia. Pilot Alfred Richter, commander of the expedition, documented in his logbook the discovery of a series of ice-free oases within the interior of the continent. One of these, later identified as the Schumacher Oasis, was a basin of roughly 35 square kilometers, with an average temperature of -5 degrees Celsius, the presence of liquid water in the form of unfrozen lakes, and a network of natural cavities of depth and extent not fully mapped during the 1939 reconnaissance flights. The oasis's average temperature was 20 to 25 degrees higher than that of the surrounding Antarctic terrain. The presence of permanent liquid water at that latitude, without ice coverage or artificial heating, represented an exceptional habitability condition on a continent where the annual average temperature ranged between -30 and -60 degrees Celsius. These natural cavities were not deeply mapped in 1939 because aerial reconnaissance could not determine the true extent of the underground structures. The Schwabenland expedition reports described the existence of this network of cavities in terms that the German Naval Command classified before the Allies had access to the complete expedition files. India built its Maitree Antarctic base in the Schumacher Oasis in 1989. Russia built its Novolazarevskaya base in the same oasis, expanding its permanent facilities during the 1990s. Both scientific bases were established at the exact point Alfred Richter had documented in his 1939 logbook. The coincidence of location between the oasis that German pilots had mapped as exceptionally habitable and the spot where two nuclear powers independently chose to build permanent bases in this sector of the Antarctic continent has no explanation in the public records of either scientific expedition. The question raised jointly by Dönitz's statement and the Schwabenland expedition reports was one of logistics. Building and maintaining a permanent facility in the interior of Antarctica required a sustained flow of materials, fuel, personnel, and equipment that no aircraft of the era could provide at that distance with such regularity. The only transport system with the operational autonomy necessary for an undeclared Europe-Antarctica route in 1944 and 1945 was the long-range ocean-going submarine. Kriegsmarine records listed in May 1945 more than 100 U-boats whose whereabouts could not be confirmed by the Allies with documentary certainty. 100 submarines missing from the records was not a minor statistical discrepancy in the surrender accounting system. It was a category the Allies internally referred to as unconfirmed units, and in the following years, locating them through sunken wrecks failed to account for all of the missing vessels. Type 9 U-boats had an operational range of 26,000 kilometers on the surface and could be refueled at sea by specialized tanker submarines. The distance from the North Atlantic to Antarctica, via the most direct route across the Western Atlantic, was approximately 12,000 kilometers, well within the operational margin of a Type 9 with proper refueling. The Argentine Navy detected unidentified submarine activity in Patagonian waters between May and August 1945. This activity was recorded in internal documents that Argentine naval commands did not communicate to Allied authorities during the interrogations of the U-530 and U-977. The Allies learned of these records through independent intelligence channels and requested them from the Argentine authorities. The response was that the documents covering the period in question were being processed. They were not delivered during the years in which the interrogations of the two commanders remained active. The case of the German submarine U-234 demonstrated that operational U-boats in the final weeks of the war could transport nuclear cargo without declaring it in the documentation submitted to the authorities that captured them. The U-234 was intercepted by the U.S. Navy on May 14, 1945, 6 days after Germany's official surrender, en route to Japan. On board, among other materials, were 560 kilograms of uranium oxide packaged in cylinders with gold interior lining. The gold lining was not a technical luxury. It was the containment solution German engineers had developed for a radioactive material that degraded most conventional metals under prolonged exposure. This level of sophistication in handling nuclear material was technically superior to what Germany's official atomic program, known as the Uran Project, had documented as its capabilities in 1945. Manhattan Project physicists who examined the U-234's cargo in Portsmouth, including J. Robert Oppenheimer, noted in their reports that the quality of the uranium oxide and the packaging method were consistent with a nuclear program more advanced than Allied intelligence had estimated for Germany at that stage of the war. When CNN requested full access to the technical reports on the U-234 cargo from the U.S. government in 1983, the official response invoked national security classification as the reason for withholding the complete documentation. The U-234 had surrendered 38 years earlier, yet the technical reports on its cargo remained classified as national security secrets in 1983. The operational implication of that cargo was as follows. If a U-boat that surrendered to the U.S. Navy in May 1945 carried 560 kilograms of uranium oxide in gold-lined cylinders, a U-boat that did not surrender to any Allied authority could carry a comparable or different shipment to a destination that no official record identified. New Swabia, the Antarctic sector Germany claimed in 1939, and whose subsequent geological exploration revealed mineral reserves including uranium, was not protected by any international treaty on Antarctic mining until 1991, when the Madrid Protocol established for the first time a moratorium on mineral resource extraction on the continent. Between 1945 and 1991, there was no international legal instrument preventing the exploitation of natural resources in the Antarctic sector explored by Germany in 1939. Martin Bormann was Hitler's last personal secretary and the administrator of the Nazi Party's funds during the final years of the war. He was the man who controlled exactly where the Reich's money was, which third-country financial institutions held German assets under fictitious names, and which transfer networks had been established to move capital out of Germany before the Allies froze identifiable accounts. He disappeared in May 1945 during the fall of Berlin. His body was identified, according to the official version, through DNA analysis conducted in 1998 on skeletal remains discovered in Berlin in 1972. The Nuremberg tribunal tried him in absentia and sentenced him to death. Western intelligence services investigated his possible survival and presence in South America for decades. The archives of the Wiesenthal Center contained informant testimonies placing him in Argentina and Brazil during the 1950s. The 1998 identification was accepted by the German government, which officially closed the case. Not all independent researchers analyzing the methodology of that identification reached the same conclusion regarding its finality. The Argentine Central Bank documents for the period 1945 to 1955 included records of gold fund movements with no declared origin, whose provenance the Wiesenthal Center analysts, who obtained partial access to these records following President Mealy's announcement in March 2025, could not attribute to any known European source. These transactions did not match the documented patterns of ratline transfers previously identified, which had been channeled primarily through Vatican institutions and Swiss banks with accounts in Argentina. They corresponded to a different transfer pattern, characterized by the import of physical metal rather than currency, through routes that the central bank records described as maritime. The complete files of the Argentine Ministry of the Navy for the period 1945 to 1947, which would have identified the ships making these deliveries, were still under review for declassification at the time these data were released. What this body of evidence documented was not a closed chain of proof. It was a series of records from independent sources, some declassified unilaterally by governments without coordinating publication with others, converging on a set of questions that none of the official investigations had answered. Who financed the escape of Third Reich leaders after 1945, and what networks allowed them to live for decades in South America? The system that had absorbed the second Wermuth in the interior of Argentina in July 1945 was an infrastructure of identities, documentation, and support networks that had been operating for years and, by 1945, was processing an unprecedented volume of arrivals. Adolf Eichmann arrived in Argentina in 1950 with documentation from the International Committee of the Red Cross, issued under the name Ricardo Clement, of German nationality, profession mechanic. The process of obtaining this documentation had passed through Rome, where the network known as the Vatican Rat Line, organized around Austrian Bishop Alois Hudal and later the Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganovic, issued displaced persons certificates that served as the basis for Red Cross passports and entry visas to Argentina. Eichmann had been responsible for the logistical coordination of transporting European Jews to the extermination camps, the central figure in the bureaucracy of extermination who was relied upon to translate political decisions into executable railway operations. In Buenos Aires, he worked for 10 years under his false name at a Mercedes-Benz plant in the San Fernando neighborhood. The Israeli intelligence service, Mossad, located him in 1960 through an identification operation that took several years to confirm that Ricardo Clement was Eichmann. He was kidnapped on a street in Buenos Aires on May 11, 1960, secretly transported to Israel and tried in Jerusalem before a court that broadcast the entire trial to international networks. He was executed on June 1, 1962. He had lived in Argentina for 10 years in a city of several million inhabitants under a false name that no Allied intelligence service had uncovered until Mossad built its identification operation using independent sources separate from the Argentine archives. Joseph Mengele arrived in Argentina in 1949, not under a false name, but his own. He entered the country with a Paraguayan passport issued in the name of Josef Mengele and obtained legal Argentine citizenship in 1956 under that same name. Mengele had been the selection doctor at Auschwitz, the officer who decided on the arrival platform of the camp, who would be sent directly to the gas chambers and who would be assigned to medical experiments or forced labor. The Argentine system in 1949 did not need to hide him because no one was looking for him. It was not until Eichmann's trial in 1961 turned the hunt for Nazis into an international political priority that Mengele began to move. He left Argentina that same year, took refuge in Paraguay and later in Brazil, where he died in 1979 of a stroke while swimming at Bertioga Beach. He died without ever being captured. His remains, identified in 1985 through forensic analysis and confirmed by DNA in 1992, were located in a Brazilian cemetery under the name Wolfgang Gerhard, the identity of an Austrian citizen who had died years earlier and whose identity Mengele had adopted. Erich Priebke arrived in Argentina in 1948, also using his real name. He settled in Bariloche in the Argentine Patagonia, where the local German origin community was both dense enough and insular enough to avoid raising questions about the European backgrounds of its members. Priebke had been the SS officer responsible for the execution of the Ardeatine Caves massacre in Rome in March 1944, where 335 Italian civilians and prisoners were executed in retaliation for a partisan attack that had killed 33 German soldiers. He lived in Bariloche for 46 years under his own name, directed the local German school, participated actively in community life, and was located by a journalist from the American network ABC in 1994, who interviewed him on the street with Priebke showing no attempt to deny his identity. He was extradited to Italy in 1995 at the age of 81. The man responsible for the largest civilian massacre in occupied Italy had lived in Bariloche under his own name and history for nearly half a century, because in 46 years no one had submitted an extradition request to any Argentine authority that the authorities could not simply ignore. The money that had financed the Third Reich apparatus followed a route that began in Buenos Aires, passed through Switzerland, and ended in accounts that went unclaimed for decades because their owners were dead, missing, or living under other identities. No prosecutor undertook the reconstruction of this route in any trial. It was a bank employee who, in 1984, discovered a document in the basement of a liquidation office in Buenos Aires. Pedro Filippuzzi worked in the purchasing and supplies department of the National Development Bank when his boss, about to retire, handed him a folder of documents that had been archived for decades without anyone ever reopening it. The folder contained a complete list of 12,000 individuals and companies affiliated with the organization known as the German Union of Guilds, the name adopted by the German Labour Front after President Ortiz's government had banned its original name due to its openly Nazi profile. The organization had operated from 2 offices in Buenos Aires, at 900 Moreno Street and 145 25 de Mayo Street, less than 2 blocks from the Casa Rosada. On the 4th floor of the 25 de Mayo building were the offices of the Argentine Nazi Party. On the ground floor operated the Germanico Bank of South America, of German capital, where the organization maintained account number 4063. The document Filippuzzi discovered in 1984 listed all 12,000 members, including their names, membership numbers, and connections to companies and financial institutions. Among the members was Ludwig Freude, number 405. Freude was a German timber entrepreneur residing in Argentina who led the Aid for Winter campaign, a fundraising effort among German companies established in the country, with the funds sent directly to the Reich. The Nazi government had awarded him the German Eagle for industrial merit, the distinction Berlin granted to foreign collaborators of exceptional usefulness to the interests of the Third Reich. The same honor had once been given to the American industrialist Henry Ford. Freude also presided over the German Transatlantic Bank, located at Reconquista and Bartolomé Mitre streets in downtown Buenos Aires, and from that position he maintained connections with Swiss banks, enabling the transfer of accumulated capital beyond the reach of the Allies. The funds entering account number 4063 at the Germanico Bank of South America did not remain in Argentina. The Germanico Bank functioned as a receiving node. The final destination was the Schweizerische Kreditanstalt, the Swiss bank that, decades later, after successive mergers and name changes, would become Credit Suisse. The route was opaque enough to withstand any investigation that did not have the original documents from both ends of the chain. The GOU government had ordered the list destroyed in 1943 when Allied pressure on Argentina became unbearable. No copies remained in Congress. No copies remained in the party archives. The only surviving copy was the one Filippuzzi's boss had kept secret for 4 decades in the basement of a Buenos Aires bank office. The list included, in addition to private individuals and companies, organizations of systemic relevance. Among the members was IG Farben, the chemical conglomerate that produced Zyklon B used in the gas chambers of the extermination camps. Also listed were the German Transatlantic Bank and the Germanico Bank of South America. More than 300 German companies with active operations in Argentina during the years when the Reich financed the war with the profits of continental industry were included. According to calculations by the Wiesenthal Center, the estimated funds accumulated in account number 4063 and in the linked accounts maintained by the Schweizerische Kreditanstalt for members of the organization reached 35 billion euros in present-day value. The Wiesenthal Center submitted a claim to Credit Suisse in 2020. The bank hired former U.S. federal prosecutor Neil Barofsky to lead an independent investigation into its ties to Nazism. Barofsky and his team accessed the bank's archives, occupying 300,000 linear meters of shelving. By late 2023, the investigators had discovered thousands of handwritten documents that had not been examined in any previous review, including a U.S. blacklist of individuals with potential Nazi connections and records of intermediaries who had operated as channels for concealing gold and expropriated assets. In 2022, before completing his work, Credit Suisse dismissed Barofsky. Republican Senator Chuck Grassley, who then chaired the Senate Budget Committee and had sent the same letter to Argentine President Milei that he sent to President Trump requesting cooperation in the investigation, publicly accused the bank of obstructing the process. Credit Suisse argued that Borowski's findings did not provide new information beyond what had already been investigated in the 1990s. In 2023, Credit Suisse collapsed as an independent entity and was acquired by UBS for 3.25 billion Swiss francs. On Tuesday of the first week of February 2025, Borowski appeared before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee. His preliminary conclusions identified 890 accounts with potential Nazi links, 628 in the names of individuals and 262 in the names of legal entities. The investigation had documented that Credit Suisse had maintained accounts for the economic arm of the SS. It also documented that the bank had directly financed the rat lines, payments of bribes to French and Swiss officials to facilitate the transit of fugitives through those countries, the acquisition of fraudulent travel documents, and coverage of living and transport expenses for people fleeing Allied justice. Borowski testified before the senators that Credit Suisse had maintained active accounts for many of the key ratline operatives, and that it was highly likely that these accounts had financed the bribes that cleared the way to Argentina for an undetermined number of war criminals. He described the bank's archives to the committee as the final scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, saying that if he took documents out of there, he almost could have taken them home to New York. While Borowski was testifying, UBS informed his team that, for the first time, it would invoke legal privilege over a set of documents and would withdraw their access to materials that had until then been available. 150 documents were linked to the 1999 restitution agreement, in which Swiss banks had paid $1.25 billion in compensation for accounts belonging to Holocaust victims that had remained inactive after the war. Borowski testified before the Senate that he could not complete his investigation without access to these documents, that each of the protected records could contain hundreds or even thousands of pages of information, and that he could not guarantee in his final report that the withheld documents did not affect any of his conclusions. That same month, the president of the World Jewish Congress, Ronald Lauder, told Bloomberg that in the 1999 agreement the Jewish community had left between $5 and $10 billion on the table, and that it would not make that mistake again. Borowski's investigation remained open at the time of these events, and his final report had not yet been published. The grandchildren of Ludwig Freude were still, in 2025, claiming access to their grandfather's inheritance funds from UBS. Their father, Rodolfo, who had been Perón's personal secretary from the first floor of the Casa Rosada, and who, according to historian Uki Gogni, had provided documentary support for the arrivals of Eichmann, Mengele, and others, had submitted at least 14 requests to the Swiss bank before dying of cancer in 2003 without receiving a response. The bank claimed it had found no accounts in Freud's name. The Wiesenthal Center pointed out that the absence of accounts under real names was precisely the mechanism that made the system function. The money was not under the names of its real owners because that had been the purpose of the financial architecture from the very beginning. German investments in Argentina in 1945 exceeded 3 billion pesos at the time. The Perón government purchased enemy property in bulk, excluding the most powerful German companies among the liquidated assets, thereby preserving the business infrastructure that the network needed to continue operating after the war ended. The financial scale of this system was mirrored in government documentation that remained classified for decades. On April 28, 2025, the General Archive of the Nation published, following a restoration and digitization process authorized by President Javier Milei after his meeting with representatives of the Wiesenthal Center at the Casa Rosada on February 18th of that year, 1,850 documentary pieces organized into 7 files on Nazi activities in Argentina. In parallel, nearly 1,300 secret and reserved presidential decrees issued between 1957 and 2005 were declassified, including records on arms acquisitions, the organization of intelligence apparatuses, and anti-communist operations under various administrations. The 7 files declassified in April 2025 covered Josef Mengele, Adolf Eichmann, Ante Pavlik, Josef Schwamberger, Eduard Roschmann, Gustav Wagner, Walter Kutschmann, Martin Bormann, and Klaus Barbie. The file on Kutschmann documented a story that precisely illustrated the margins of tolerance within the Argentine system at its different stages. Kutschmann had been an officer of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile extermination units deployed in Eastern Europe that carried out mass shootings outside the permanent concentration camp infrastructure. He arrived in Argentina and lived in Buenos Aires under a false name for decades. Journalist Alfredo Serra located him in January 1975 in the Vicente Lopez neighborhood. Nazi hunter Simon Wiesenthal filed the extradition request. Interpol issued the arrest warrant that same year. Kutschmann escaped. Argentine authorities revoked his citizenship in 1975. 10 years later, in 1985, Interpol agents apprehended him again in Vicente Lopez, the same city where he lived. The Anti-Defamation League provided the authorities with identifying information: scars, tattoos, and blood type. Kutschmann was kept under hospital imprisonment due to his deteriorating health. He died of a heart attack in August 1986 before extradition could be formalized. He would have been the first Nazi war criminal extradited by Argentina had he survived the judicial waiting period. The file on Ante Pavelic documented the presence in Argentina of the leader of the Croatian Ustaše regime, the independent state of Croatia, which had operated between 1941 and 1945 as a German satellite in the Balkans. Pavelic had led a regime that between 1941 and 1945 executed hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma in its own extermination camps, among which the Jasenovac camp reached a level of killing capacity that led Heinrich Himmler himself to request that Pavelic moderate his methods. He arrived in Argentina in 1948 with documentation provided by Croatian ecclesiastical networks linked to the Vatican, the same mechanism Eichmann used 2 years later. Perón granted him protection, and Pavelic settled in Buenos Aires, where the anti-communist Croatian émigré community was numerous enough to provide him with social cover. In April 1957, he survived an assassination attempt in Buenos Aires when 2 gunmen shot him on the street, causing serious injuries. He survived and fled to Spain, where Franco granted him asylum. He died in Madrid in December 1959 as a consequence of the wounds from the attack, without ever being tried by any international court. The Argentine archives of 2025 documented his passage through the country with intelligence records that the authorities had classified and that had not been included in any extradition requests submitted during the 11 years Pavelic lived between Buenos Aires and his subsequent relocations. The file on Edward Roschmann documented the officer nicknamed the Butcher of Riga, commander of the Riga ghetto between 1941 and 1944, responsible for liquidation operations that cost the lives of tens of thousands of people. He arrived in Argentina in 1948 under a false identity and lived in Buenos Aires for nearly 3 decades. He was identified in 1977, fled to Paraguay that same year, and died there shortly afterward at the age of 70 of natural causes. The Argentine archives of 2025 included intelligence documentation on his presence in the country, indicating that the authorities had been aware of his real identity during part of his residence in Argentina, without that knowledge prompting any formal action before any court. The most extensive and debated file of the 7 was the one covering Martin Bormann. The documents declassified by the General Archive of the Nation in 2025 contained 2 separate files on him, one with press clippings placing him in Bolivia and Paraguay in dates after 1945, and another with an Argentine intelligence document recording an arrival in the country in 1948. This document differed from Western intelligence investigations or informant testimonies that had, for decades, placed Bormann in various locations across South America. It was a record produced by the Argentine state intelligence apparatus itself, which in 1948 documented Bormann's presence on national territory with a date of entry. The skeletal remains that German authorities accepted in 1998 as belonging to Bormann had been found in Berlin in 1972 under circumstances that forensic analysis at the time linked to a death occurring near the bunker in the final days of April or the first days of May 1945. If this documentary has reached you, subscribe and activate the notification bell. There are many more stories waiting for you.